They say a Chicago winter will find every crack in your foundation, every poorly sealed window, every forgotten vulnerability. My family didn't need the wind or the ice. Their silence was a more insidious cold, a chill that got in through the walls and settled deep in the bones, leaving a frost on the inside of your heart. For most of my life, I was the daughter they forgot to mention, the one whose ambition was an inconvenient truth. 7 years ago, I vanished from their lives with a single suitcase and a borrowed coat, disappearing into the city's indifferent grid. They didn't call when my brother was dying. But the day I walked into his ICU room, a nurse looked at my badge, then at my face, and said, "Wait, you're the new head of cardiology?" In their carefully curated story, I was a ghost, a failure. In the unforgiving light of the real world, I was the one they would have to beg to save him. The question wasn't if I would do my job, but why they had been so terrified that I could. There is a particular kind of quiet at family parties that isn't peaceful. It's the sound of active erasure. I felt it acutely that day, 7 years ago, standing near the frosted patio door of their Lincoln Park home, watching the first fat snowflakes of the season dissolve against the glass. I was sipping ginger ale from a heavy crystal wine glass. I didn't ask for. They always handed me something slightly off, a subtle, constant reminder that I didn't quite belong, that my presence was something to be managed. The room buzzed with the forced, brittle laughter of people performing happiness. Aunts in muted cashmere sweaters discussed vacation homes in Naples. Cousins whose lives had followed a pre-approved trajectory of marriage and children showed off baby pictures on their phones. And in the center of the dining room, that same dreadful shrimp cocktail ring, a monument to uninspired tradition, sat sweating on a bed of limp lettuce. It was my brother Evan's 35th birthday. The dining room table was dressed for a state dinner, with flickering candles and an arsenal of silverware. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a series of glossy, framed photos chronicled Evan's life. Evan graduating, Evan winning a sailing trophy, Evan with his beaming parents. I wasn't in a single frame. My designated seat, as always, was at the far end of the table, the one next to the drafty window. When the moment for speeches came, my father, Harrison, clinked his glass with a spoon. He stood tall, his posture still echoing his years as a high-ranking city official, a man accustomed to commanding attention. "To Evan," he began, his voice a warm, confident baritone that filled the room. "Our pride and joy. The rock of this family." He paused, a theatrical smirk playing on his lips. Every family has a rock, of course, and well, every family has its rolling stone too, gathering no moss. Laughter erupted around the table, unfiltered and sharp. It wasn't malicious, not exactly. It was worse. It was casual, unthinking cruelty. My Aunt Carol chuckled heartily. Evan smiled, a golden, effortless smile that had always been his greatest currency, and he didn't look at me. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks and tried to conjure a small laugh of my own, a hollow sound of acquiescence. From across the room, my mother Margaret shot me a look, lips pressed into a thin line, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of her head. It was a silent, familiar warning. Don't you dare ruin this. Don't make a scene. So I didn't. I never did. The thing about being called useless, even when it's wrapped in the pretty paper of a joke, is that it doesn't hit you like a slap. It's a slow-acting poison. It seeps in. It colonizes you. That week, I had received the acceptance letter for my first co-authored paper on cardiac care disparities in a major medical journal. It was the culmination of a year of sleepless nights and relentless research. At the university hospital where I was a resident, my attending physician had shaken my hand, his eyes shining with genuine pride. But here, in this house, that achievement was a foreign currency with no value. They didn't know, and worse, they wouldn't have cared. My own medical school graduation was a ghost of a memory. I'd bought my own gown from a clearance rack online, the fabric cheap and scratchy. I crossed the stage alone, my name echoing into an auditorium where the row of seats I had reserved for my family sat conspicuously, painfully empty. Later that day, sitting in a cheap Thai restaurant with a few other interns, I scrolled through social media. Margaret had posted a glowing tribute. "So proud of our Evan for his latest Community Leadership Award. What a son." There was a picture of the whole family beaming at a celebratory luncheon I hadn't been invited to. My graduation wasn't mentioned. People talk about being invisible like it's a poetic state of being. It's not. It's clinical. It's the slow, methodical process of being erased. So I stopped fighting for visibility in their world. I started building my own, in the quiet, sterile halls of hospitals, in the hushed intensity of research libraries. I took extra shifts to pay for my board exams. I applied for fellowships they never knew about. I learned to be my own witness, my own cheerleader. The last time they tried to dictate the terms of my life, it was over a roast chicken on a Sunday night. The table was set with the good silver, the candles were lit. It was an ambush disguised as a family dinner. "We've been talking," Margaret began, her hands folded primly on the table. "We worry about you, Thea. This residency. It's so all-consuming, so stressful. Maybe it's not the right path for a young woman." Harrison didn't bother softening the blow. He slid a brochure across the table. "It's not too late to pivot. There's a 2-year sonography program at the City College. It's practical. Good hours, stable benefits. It's a respectable career." I stared at the brochure. It featured a smiling woman in pastel scrubs. "We can't, in good conscience, support a choice we don't believe in," he continued, his voice calm and resolute. "If you want to continue chasing this pipe dream, you'll do it without our financial help or our roof over your head." There was no yelling, no slammed doors, just a clean, calculated amputation. I didn't argue, I didn't beg. I stood up, walked to my room, and began to pack. In a dusty box under my bed, I kept the things they never displayed: science fair ribbons, tutoring awards, newspaper clippings about my volunteer work. And I took that box and left everything else. The trophies they'd bought me for sports I hated, the perfectly coordinated bedspread Margaret had chosen, the framed photos of a smiling girl who no longer existed. As I walked out, Harrison stood by the door, a sentinel guarding the life I was leaving. "The world doesn't care who you are, Thea," he said, his final piece of fatherly advice. "I know," I said, my hand on the doorknob. "That's why I'll earn who I become." I left in a taxi as the first heavy snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the Chicago streets in a layer of pristine, cold white. The silence from them was immediate and absolute, but it was worse than silence. It was sabotage. Months later, deep into my first year of a grueling fellowship, I was funding myself. I was reviewing old emails and found one from a prestigious medical foundation dated from the previous year. It was a scholarship offer, a significant one that would have eased my financial burden immensely. Beneath it was a reply I had never written. "Thank you for considering, Thea, but she has decided to withdraw her application at this time to pursue other opportunities. We appreciate your consideration." It was signed Margaret Reed. She hadn't even bothered to pretend to be me. She hadn't just hoped I would fail. She had actively, secretly engineered it. I never confronted her. What was the point? I knew the script by heart. She would have claimed it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. She would have said she was trying to protect me from the disappointment of a demanding career. It was always about protecting their narrative, their comfort, their story. It was never about protecting me, so I started a new kind of file on my computer, not for revenge, but for the record. Screenshots, emails, printouts. A quiet, digital archive of the truth. Proof, if only for myself, that I wasn't crazy. 7 years passed. 7 brutal Chicago winters. I finished my fellowship. I published more papers. I accepted a position at a leading hospital in Seattle. I rose through the ranks, fueled by coffee and a quiet, relentless determination. I built a name for myself, brick by painstaking brick. And then, at 6:42 a.m., on a Tuesday morning, my phone rang. An old friend from med school. "Thea, have you heard? It's Evan. He had a massive heart attack. He's in the ICU at Northwestern Memorial." The silence that followed the news was heavy with everything unsaid. No one from my family had called. My brother was fighting for his life, and I, a leading cardiologist, was the last to know. I booked the first flight out of Seattle. On the plane, I pulled a creased, folded paper from my wallet, a note from a long-ago mentor, Professor Davies. "Thea, I believe in who you are, not where you came from. You belong in this field. Keep going." That note had been my family for 7 years. I entered the hospital through a side entrance, my own hospital ID badge clipped to my coat. The title underneath my name, Chief of Cardiology, Seattle General, felt foreign and strange in this city, this building. The waiting area outside the cardiac ICU was a familiar tableau of sterile tension. Harrison was pacing, his jaw tight. Margaret was on her phone, her face a mask of strained composure. They didn't see me arrive. Then, a young nurse bustled out of Evan's room, her eyes scanning a chart. She looked up, saw me standing there, and stopped short. Her gaze flickered from my face to my badge and back again. The recognition dawned slowly, then all at once. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice carrying in the hushed hall. "Dr. Reed, are you, you're Thea Reed, the new cardiology chief from Seattle. We just read your paper on post-infarction myocardial recovery in grand rounds last week." Harrison stopped pacing. Margaret's phone clattered from her numb fingers to the floor. From inside the room, through the glass wall, I saw Evan, pale and diminished, hooked to a dozen blinking machines, turn his head slowly toward the sound of my name. For a single suspended moment, the world stopped. No monitor beeps, no footsteps, just the crushing, deafening weight of their shock. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the nurse. "Has his pressure stabilized post-angioplasty?" I asked, my voice calm, clinical, a shield against the emotional chaos. "Yes, doctor, it dropped precipitously, but we have him on a norepinephrine drip, and he's responding." I nodded and walked toward Evan's bedside, my eyes on the monitors, not on his face. I scanned his chart, the familiar language of lab results and EKG readings, a comforting, objective reality. I documented a few observations on the digital chart, my fingers moving swiftly over the screen. I was a doctor in a hospital. I was performing my duty. The rest was just noise. As I stepped back into the hallway, another younger nurse approached me, her expression tentative. "We had to study your policy paper on health equity in my master's program," she said, blushing. "I never knew you were from Chicago." I saw Margaret's shoulders go rigid. For once in her life, she didn't have a line. She didn't know whether to correct the nurse, claim me as her own, or simply vanish. She did nothing. I gave the charge nurse my direct contact information. "Call my cell if his troponin levels don't trend down or if he goes into VFib. Any other routine updates can go through the attending physician on call." It was standard procedure, professional, final. As I turned to leave, Harrison's voice, low and strained, cut through the air. "You're not staying." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of profound disbelief. I didn't turn around. I didn't flinch. I just kept walking toward the elevators. The voicemail from Margaret came that night. I listened to it once. "Thea," she began, her voice thick with a strange, self-pitying sorrow. "I know you're busy. I wanted to say, I was wrong." A long pause, filled with what sounded like a sniffle. We didn't know you would turn out this way. If you have time tomorrow, maybe we could talk. I met her at a sterile coffee shop in the hospital lobby. She looked older, smaller than I remembered. She danced around meaningless topics until she finally leaned forward, getting to the real reason for the meeting. We were wondering, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. If there's any chance Evan could be transferred to your hospital in Seattle, you have the best resources, and maybe you could oversee his case personally. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I don't handle interhospital transfers, Margaret. But your position, she pressed, her eyes pleading. Your influence. A single call from you. Thank you for the coffee, I said, standing up. Her face crumpled in surprise. I had ended the scene before she could deliver her closing lines. Back at my hotel, a certified letter was waiting. It was from Harrison's lawyer. It was a formal request for my expert consultation on Evan's case, and in a breathtaking display of transactional audacity, it asked me to sign off on a request to have Evan moved to the top of a regional transplant list, citing my professional standing and intimate family knowledge as justification. It was never an apology. It was a transaction. They weren't sorry they had erased me. They were sorry I now held power they couldn't control. Later that night, I received an email from Professor Davies. Thea, he wrote. A funny thing happened today. I was reviewing an archive of old grant applications for a university committee. An entry from 7 years ago caught my eye. A brilliant, groundbreaking proposal on health literacy in underserved communities. It was submitted by Evan Reed. But I remember with perfect clarity that you wrote that paper. You sent it to me for feedback. I still have the original draft in my files with my notes on it. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a quiet, sickening snap. Evan hadn't just watched them erase me. He had actively participated. He had used my work, my intellect, my words, and passed them off as his own. He had built a part of his celebrated career on the foundation of my stolen ghost. The next time I gave a speech, it was at a National Health Equity Summit. I didn't speak of my family. I spoke of data, of policy, of the systems that fail the most vulnerable. And halfway through, I quoted a line from that stolen research paper. Access is not just about who gets through the door, I said, my voice ringing with a newfound clarity through the silent auditorium. It's about who feels safe to speak once they're inside. I didn't cite it. I didn't explain it. I just let my words, reclaimed and spoken in my own voice, hang in the air. I never spoke to my parents or my brother again. There were no dramatic confrontations, no final goodbyes. There was only the quiet, steady click of a door being locked for the final time. Closure isn't something they give you. It's the moment you realize, with a deep and abiding peace, that you don't need anything from them anymore. Not their approval, not their apology, not even their recognition. They tried to define me by the name on my birth certificate, a name they could diminish, ignore, and erase, but they could not touch the title I earned. Your family gives you a name, but you build your identity. And an identity forged in fire, in silence, and in the relentless pursuit of your own worth cannot be erased.